Welcome to Understanding Islam, second series, Standing Before God. This week we're going to look at the mosque in the place of the Muslim community. If we went back to Mecca in the early period of the Prophet's life, then once the revelation began and he began to pray as a Muslim, we see that he would offer his prayers near the Kaaba, facing through the Kaaba toward Jerusalem. And when the local politics would permit it, other members of the Muslim community would gather with him there in that place. Now, once they moved from Mecca to Medina, the situation changes. So it's in Medina that we want to begin today. We know that Muhammad, along with his companion Abu Bakr, were making their own hijrah, their migration from Mecca to Medina, and people were coming out and inviting the Prophet to come and stay with them. But instead, the Prophet allowed his camel to wander freely until it came to a natural stop. And the camel came to a stop in a fairly deserted piece of ground with palm trees, which had been used as a place for burial. And that was the place that the Prophet decided he would build his new base in Medina. So he bought that piece of land from the two orphans that owned it, and then he started to have it cleared so that there could be a courtyard which was to become the first mosque. He had the grave markers moved out, he had the trees cleared out, and a wall built of sun-baked earth bricks so that it would delineate the mosque and stop any animals from wandering through so that everybody would know this place. To the north side of this courtyard, which was the side facing toward Jerusalem, they put up some of the palm trees as pillars, and then they roofed over it with some leaves, and this became the shelter in which the Prophet would lead the prayers in Medina. 16 months into the time in Medina, the verse was revealed which set the Qibla for the Muslim community from this time onwards on the Kaaba in Mecca. Now, this was actually to the south side of the Prophet's mosque. And so they built a similar shelter on the south side, and that became then the place from which the Prophet led the prayers. The north side shelter was now called the Sufa, and it was here that the poor and the homeless would gather. They would be fed, some of them would sleep there, and then traditionally after time, this was the place that some Muslims would gather who were looking for training and guidance from the Prophet on the inner path, the mystical path of Islam, and hence the name Sufi. In Arabic, the word for mosque is masjid, which comes from the verb to prostrate. So a masjid is a place of prostration. This shows us something about its primary function, but it has lots of other functions as well, dating from this time of the Prophet's mosque in Medina. It was the place where he received delegations, whether they be Muslims or non-Muslims. It was the place where he held court. He would be there if people wanted to come and bring petitions to him for him to give them a ruling. It would be the place where he would teach people. He would promulgate newly revealed verses of the Quran there, and he would give regular addresses to the people. It would be the place, therefore, of community meeting, and also of community gathering in times of a crisis. So the mosque is the center of the community life, its principal function being that of prayer, but having many other functions too. Now, as the Muslim community expanded away from Mecca into new territories, one of the first things they'd built in a newly acquired town or city was a mosque, because that was to be the center of the Muslim community. In some places where Christians predominated beforehand, it was not uncommon to find that a church was divided, one part being used as a mosque, another part being used as a church. In some places, as time went on, where more Christians became Muslims, then church buildings would be taken over as mosques. We see in a place like Palestine, for example, it was quite common to build a mosque at a place associated with one of the biblical prophets, at Hebron, for example, the place of Abraham. Or in Jerusalem, the place of so many of the earlier prophets, including Jesus, there were actually many mosques in Medina in the time of the prophet. Some of them tended to be quite small, just for one clan, just for one village group within the wider conurbation of Medina. And this gives us another model. It gives us the model of people having mosques at home or in their extended family compounds for the use of the family on a day-to-day basis, perhaps in a neighborhood, on a street corner, in a part of a village. And then we get larger mosques. These were the mosques that we use for Friday assemblies. And these small mosques would close for Friday prayer, and everybody would go to the biggest mosque in town, the Friday Mosque. And then when it came time for Eid, the great festivals during the year, the tradition, again following on from the Prophet, was to try to find an open-air piece of ground that was large enough that the whole community could come together and celebrate Eid prayers there together. Of course, the ultimate extreme of this togetherness is the once-in-a-lifetime, once-a-year Hajj assembly in Mecca. So we can see that the community is living through different experiences, different sizes, as the year goes by, as the community expands. So we see that the mosque then has a function for prayer. It has a function also for education. There is a tradition that in a good mosque, at the foot of every pillar there sits a scholar, and around the scholar sits a circle of students learning in that place. So it became a place of education in small groups and also large lectures, as we would say today. It was also a place for the community, where the community could gather together if there was a matter of importance that they had to discuss. It was the natural place as well for strangers to head to, and strangers would be found in the mosque. If there was nowhere else for them to sleep, they could sleep in that mosque. Somebody would bring them food there. More likely, somebody would take them home and accommodate them there. And so we get the development of the tradition that every stranger, every traveller has a right to 3 days hospitality in coming into a Muslim community. The mosque is also the place for guidance. It's where you go if you want to seek out wise and learned Muslims who can help you to resolve a certain problem about living a Muslim way of life. It's the place also for circles of remembrance, the zikr circles that we have seen before. And finally, during the last 10 days of Ramadan, it becomes a place of seclusion. the Prophet used to go into seclusion when he would cut himself off from the world. And this seclusion lives on in the Muslim community to this day in what is called ihtikaf, at the end of Ramadan, the last 10 days of seclusion. The mosques are the place where the Muslims gather, all of them. It was absolutely normal in Medina in the time of the Prophet that men and women should pray together as one congregation in the mosque of the Prophet, with him leading them in prayer. And the way that that prayer was assembled became one of the ways that mosques were organized from that time onwards. That is, one single large prayer room with the leader at the front, the ranks of men behind him, and then a space, and then the ranks of women behind them. And the reason for this are reasons of modesty. You see, when people form up in ranks like this, they actually form up touching shoulder to shoulder. And in some schools of Islam, they actually also touch with the sides of their feet as well. Now you can imagine that a man who is praying next to a woman, touching at the sides of their feet, touching at their upper arms, he is likely to be distracted from his prayers. Likewise, a woman praying amongst a group of men. Therefore, so that people could concentrate on their prayer alone, then one single congregation, 2 blocks, a block for the men and a block for the women, one prayer leader who leads them all. And again, the discipline of the eyes is very important. People are taught you are to focus your eyes on the place on the floor where your head will come to rest. And in that way, nothing is allowed to distract from the worship of God. 2 other layouts for mosques become common in Muslim societies. The first is a 2-chamber mosque, in which you've got 2 rooms parallel side by side, one for the men, one for the women, and they are separated. They might be separated by a wall, or they could be separated by a curtain or a partition of some sort. And in such a mosque, the front row for the men and the front row for the women is on the same line. The third form, as architectural building techniques develop, is to build a mosque which is taller. And now you can have the ground floor prayer room for the men and upstairs a gallery for the women, so that again they can pray as one congregation but physically separate. If one looks around the interior of a mosque, the first thing that one tends to notice is it is a plain building. There are no pictures, there are no figures, there is nothing to distract the worshipper from the worship of God alone. You might find some copies of a Quran, you might find a Quran stand so that the Quran can be supported with respect when somebody is reading it, and you might find some tasbihs. But apart from that, the mosque space is empty and plain. It has become common for people to decorate the inside of the mosque with beautiful verses of calligraphy drawn from the Quran itself. Sometimes these are painted, sometimes these are done in ceramic work, in tiles. Sometimes one can also find geometrical patterns, either painted or in tile work too. And in different cultures at different times of history, the amount of decoration has increased or decreased in this way. One is likely to find within a mosque a place for wudu, for the ritual washing, and also, of course, toilets. And more today, one's also finding disabled access, disabled facilities, and a lift, for example, to take disabled women to the upstairs gallery, so that mosques, like all public places, should cater for all humankind. Two pieces of furnishing which one can often find within a mosque. The first is the mihrab. The mihrab is a niche which is cut into or built into the wall of the mosque, which is facing toward the Qibla. Now, in traditional societies, if you are building a mosque from scratch, you build it rectangular so that one of the walls is directly facing toward the Kaaba in Mecca. That becomes the Qibla direction, the Qibla wall. Now, into that wall you have the mihrab or niche, which is there in order to mark out the direction for prayer. It also provides a useful place for the prayer leader to pray. And so you quite often will find that the ceiling of these mihrab is curved, a bit like a shell, so that it throws the voice of the prayer leader back into the congregation. Of course, today, that function has been replaced with microphones. The other piece of furniture that one will find is a minbar. You see, when the Prophet stood in his mosque in Medina to speak to the people, at first he just used to stand with his back against one of the pillars that held up this shelter on the Qibla side. After some time, somebody brought a tree stump for him to stand on. And then again, somebody made a low platform so that it would raise him up so that he could be seen. Mimbar actually comes from the verb to raise up, so that you're raised up so that people can see. Now, over the centuries in history, people have built huge mosques, and sometimes you need to raise people up to a big height so that they can be seen and heard by people. And we sometimes will find a mosque 10 or 12 steps high and with a sounding board over the speaker to bounce the voice so that it spreads amongst the people gathered. If one looks at the exterior of a mosque, one thing which has become quite typical is for a dome. A dome is really useful. Inside, it helps to spread the voice. It also provides an additional volume of air over the people, which can cool and give them oxygen, but also it gives a sense of the wide expanse of the earth. The whole world is a mosque. And so building a dome has become a typical piece of Muslim architecture. The other thing that we associate as an external marker of a mosque is a minaret. A minaret is generally a tall, rather slender tower. This was used originally to call the people to prayer. If we go back again to the Prophet's time in Medina, he asked Bilal, who was an Abyssinian man with a big, strong voice, he should be the one who should call people to prayer. And to help his voice spread further, they would ask him to mount onto the roof of a nearby house. So the roof of a nearby house gives way to the roof of the mosque and eventually the building of a little tower so that the voice could spread. And it's not unusual to see mosques that have minarets on different sides facing toward the places where people lived. These minarets also become important as they grow taller and become more distinctive. They are a marker. When you come into a strange town or city, you know exactly where the mosque is. You just see the minaret and follow it. In fact, the word minaret in Arabic comes from the word manar, which is the lighthouse. And so it's like a lighthouse that draws people toward the mosque. The word imam is a word that we often hear in Muslim societies and in Muslim reports. It has 3 different meanings, so we always need to be clear what we're talking about. Firstly, there are the divinely appointed imams of the Shia. Secondly, there are those scholars whose influence is so huge that it spreads down through the generations. People like Imam al-Ghazali. They are also called imam. Those are not the meanings that we're going to use today. The third meaning is the one who leads the prayers. It's the prayer leader. And whenever Muslims gather together for prayer, somebody needs to lead and others follow that leader. Now, if it's a group of women or a group of women and children, then the imam will be a woman. If it's a group of men or it's a mixed group of men and women, then the imam will be a man and he will stand in front of the men's ranks for those reasons of modesty that we've already touched on. So this is the person who leads the prayer. Well, who should it be? It should be the one who is here present, who is most pious and wise. And so one looks amongst the people gathered there, and somebody is asked, please, will you act as imam? Will you lead us in the prayer? There is no priesthood in Islam. There are no sacraments. There are no people who have special powers that other people don't have. The relationship between the believer and God is direct. So any Muslim can act as imam if that person is pious and wise and knowledgeable and knows what to do. So technically, there could only be one time in one's life when one is asked to act as imam and lead the prayers. The situation changes in a mosque where you have people who are gathering regularly, hundreds, thousands of them perhaps, for regular prayers. Now you cannot go through the business of who is most pious and wise amongst us today. So what happens in a mosque is that the mosque management people, a committee for example, will actually draw up a list of those people who are authorized to lead prayers in this mosque, and then they will make sure that at least one of them is present for each of the daily prayers in that mosque. If we go another step, and a mosque has got sufficient money and a sufficient amount of work to have a professional imam, a full-time imam, now the situation changes again. First of all, the mosque committee must decide what are the jobs that we want this imam to do, drawing up a job description, as we might say. We want him to lead the daily prayers, to be present on Friday, to give the address at Friday prayers, to educate the children, to help people with the recitation of the Quran, to run classes for adults, to run classes for converts to Islam, to be present for weddings and for funerals, to be on hand to give guidance to anybody in time of need, and so on. So you work out what the job description is, and then you have to work out what the person specification is. Somebody to do this job needs to have had this degree of education, this degree of experience. So it will normally be that they have completed a full course of basic studies in Islam, which can take, well, from about 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 years, depending on where they start and from which school of Islam they come. And then you might want to demand particular experience. Such a person is going to be a scholar. A scholar in Islam is called an alim. And so we meet in mosques somebody who is called the resident alim, or alima if she is a woman. This alim is there to lead, especially in the intellectual, the educational work of that mosque, and to give guidance for people on living the Muslim way of life. One of their functions will be to give the Friday address at Friday prayers, when the prayer itself is shortened to only 2 rak'ah instead of 4, and instead there is an address or a khutbah. This may be given by the local resident imam, or there might be somebody brought in from outside as the regular khutbah giver or khatib. This khutbah will be partly in Arabic and partly in the principal languages of the people sitting here in the congregation. And that can mean in a cosmopolitan, multilingual society, sometimes the khutbah will have to be given in 2 or 3 different languages. And the khutbah can spread far and wide over matters of religious practice, over matters important to the society and the community. So it is the chance to apply the teaching of Islam to every aspect of human life. Join me next week when we will be looking at fasting in the life of a Muslim, the whole cycle of the month of Ramadan, and observing the fast during that month. I look forward to seeing you then.